Welcome back to the podcast.
We have a great show for you today.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are examining something really fundamental. We are looking at the methodology of language acquisition.
Yeah, specifically by digging into the very first day of a 30-day program titled Speak English Daily.
Right. And we are really zooming in on a technique the instructor uses throughout the material, which she refers to as shadowing.
And, the core intellectual tension here is just fascinating. It really forces us to define what the act of speaking a second language actually is at its core.
Exactly. Like, is speaking fundamentally a physical thing? A mechanical skill built on rhythm and muscle memory and momentum?
Or, conversely, does true linguistic fluency inherently require conscious cognitive engagement, focusing on grammar, structural accuracy, and active translation?
Well, this debate emerges directly from the source material's explicit instructions. On day one, the methodology asks learners to just entirely bypass grammar and translation.
Right, in favor of purely physical speech training.
Exactly. And I will be arguing that this primacy of physical momentum and rhythm is the absolute most effective way to achieve natural, unhesitating speech.
And I take the opposite view. I'll argue that discarding cognitive rules and accuracy just for the sake of mechanical mimicry is a fundamentally flawed approach to true long-term language mastery.
So let's begin by laying out our core positions. The premise of the source material is one that I just find profoundly accurate. Traditional language instruction, it overly intellectualizes what is essentially a mechanical habit.
I mean, we treat language like a math problem to be solved, right?
Yes, exactly. Like a math problem, rather than a physical act to be performed. The instructor's core thesis is stated quite simply. She says, speaking is a physical skill. Your mouth needs training, not just your brain.
Which sounds great on paper, but
Wait, let me just finish the thought. By enforcing a strict pedagogical rule of no grammar rules, no translation, just speak, the shadowing technique allows learners to internalize the actual rhythm and flow of the language. And this isn't just a theoretical concept.
no, it's used fairly widely.
Right. The validity of this purely physical approach is underscored by its use among professional language coaches, simultaneous interpreters, and actors. When you shadow, when your only job is to precisely replicate the physical sounds of the native speaker without analyzing the underlying syntax, you dramatically lower the cognitive load.
Sure, you bypass the overthinking.
Exactly. You remove the hesitation that plagues adult learners, allowing them to finally build the physical confidence required to actually speak.
I understand the appeal of that perspective, I really do. And I certainly acknowledge that physical repetition can build a baseline of confidence for a nervous speaker. However, I strongly object to the source material's explicit dismissal of cognitive processing.
Why is that dismissal such a problem, though?
Because the foundational advice here is quite literally to not worry if your accent is not perfect, and to not worry if you make mistakes. This is where the methodology becomes highly problematic. If you tell a learner to focus solely on moving their mouth and building rhythm at the total expense of grammatical accuracy, you risk a phenomenon known in linguistics as fossilization.
Right, hardwiring the errors.
Yes. When you bypass the brain and repeat an error purely for the sake of physical momentum, your neural pathways solidify that incorrect structure. It becomes remarkably difficult to unlearn later. Mimicry might create the illusion of fluency. You might sound like you know what you are saying, but mimicry does not equate to the actual comprehension required for complex, dynamic communication.
I see.
You just cannot simply parrot your way to true professional fluency.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Let's examine what the material is actually asking the learner to do, because I think the concept of bypassing the brain is, it's more nuanced than it sounds.
Nuanced how? Because to me, there is a fundamental paradox at the very heart of this first lesson.
A paradox.
Yes. The entire methodology claims to prioritize the mouth over the brain, but the actual exercises demand highly specific cognitive intent.
Walk me through what you see as the contradiction then.
Look at the specific sentences the material uses. For instance, sentence 6 in the exercise is, "I didn't catch that. Could you say it again?"
Okay.
The instructor doesn't just ask the learner to repeat the words. She gives a very specific coaching tip regarding intonation. She notes that the voice must drop at the end of the phrase. The pitch goes down, not up.
Sure, she focuses on the pitch.
Then, look at sentence 9. "I'm not sure yet, but I'll find out." She explicitly states that the key word is but, and the learner must articulate it with a slight rise in their voice.
That's entirely accurate to the source text, yes.
And the reasoning she provides is that this specific rising intonation signals professional confidence to the listener. So, here is the paradox. Signaling professional confidence, or indicating polite confusion by dropping your pitch, those are not merely physical mouth movements.
They are social cues.
Exactly. They are highly complex socio-linguistic markers. You're conveying specific social meaning and managing interpersonal dynamics. That is a deeply cognitive action. You're evaluating the social hierarchy of the room, the polite norms of a workplace, the emotional state of your conversational partner.
I see where you're going with this.
So, while the methodology claims to avoid rules and intellectualization, it is actually teaching highly sophisticated socio-pragmatic rules. It's just disguising them as physical mouth training.
That is a really interesting point. Though, I would frame it differently. I don't see that as a paradox at all.
How is it not?
I think her instruction regarding the word but and the rising pitch is actually the definitive proof of why the physical method is brilliant. It allows the learner to execute a complex cognitive concept without having to process it cognitively in real time.
That sounds like a contradiction in terms. How do you execute a cognitive concept without cognition?
Through procedural memory. Let me offer an analogy. Think about a musician learning to play a complex piece on the piano.
Okay, a pianist.
When a pianist is first learning to evoke a specific emotion, say a dramatic, confident crescendo, they don't achieve that in the moment by reviewing the underlying music theory or the mathematics of the chord progression.
Right, they aren't doing math while performing.
The teacher focuses on the physical strike of the keys, the weight of the finger, the speed of the wrist. They learn the physical performance of the phrase long before they understand the theoretical why behind it.
So you were saying the learner is basically just memorizing the sheet music?
Exactly. The source material is teaching the physical performance of English, the rhythm, the pitch, the muscular tension. By repeatedly practicing the physical sensation of saying but with a rising pitch, the brain remembers the muscular feeling of professional confidence.
Interesting.
In a real-world high-stakes conversation, the learner's brain doesn't have to desperately search its declarative memory for the rule on how to sound polite but firm. The mouth already knows the song. The physical habit circumvents the cognitive bottleneck.
The piano analogy is elegant, I'll give you that, but we have to remember the context here. Speaking a language in a professional environment is not a rehearsed piano recital where the notes never change.
Of course, it's dynamic.
It is an active, unpredictable exchange of information. And this transition from rehearsed mechanics to real-time execution brings me to my deepest concern with the material. The segment the instructor calls the Fluency Round.
Oh, the Fluency Round is arguably the most critical part of the day's progression.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why I find it so problematic. In this round, the instructor takes phrases from sentences 15 to 20. Phrases like, "I'm working on it right now," and "I'll take care of it." We have moved past just learning the notes, as you would say, and we are now dictating the tempo.
Yeah, the speed deliberately increases.
The explicit instruction given to the learner is, the goal is not perfection, the goal is momentum. Speak without stopping. The instructor pushes the learner to repeat these phrases at higher and higher velocities to the point where they are told they should feel, quote, a little out of breath.
Yes, the focus entirely shifts to overcoming inertia.
But at what cost? Pushing a learner to speak at a breathless pace while explicitly telling them to ignore perfection is a recipe for disaster. This is where fossilization takes root.
Because of the repetition.
If an adult learner drops a preposition, say they go with "I working on it" instead of "I am working on it,"
and they are instructed to repeat that error 20 times at high speed simply to maintain momentum, they are neurologically hardwiring incorrect syntax.
I hear you, but
Prioritizing a breathless rush over coherent, accurate communication fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of language, which is to be understood, not just to make noise rapidly.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it completely ignores the actual psychological reality of the adult language learner. You are prioritizing theoretical grammatical purity over the practical ability to function.
I wouldn't call wanting a basic verb to be correct theoretical purity.
But why do language learners freeze? Why do they panic in a real conversation? It is almost entirely due to what linguists call the affective filter, the anxiety, the fear, and the perfectionism that completely shuts down linguistic production. Hesitation is the death of real-world communication.
Hesitation is simply the brain attempting to ensure the output is correct.
Sure, but if the delay is too long, the conversational opportunity vanishes. Let's move away from the piano for a moment and look at it through the lens of physics. Language acquisition is like riding a bicycle.
Okay, a bicycle.
If you are constantly stopping your pedaling to look down at the gears, trying to ensure the chain is perfectly aligned, you lose your momentum, you lose your balance, and you fall over.
Fair point.
The Fluency Round is designed to break the psychological barrier of perfectionism. By pushing learners to speak without stopping until they are out of breath, the method forces them to keep pedaling. It proves to the learner that they actually can produce the sounds continuously.
Even if those sounds are structurally flawed?
In day one, absolutely, because perfection comes after production, never before. The instructor is preparing the learner for the Monday morning conversation scenario presented in the text.
Right, the office small talk.
When the boss walks up and asks for an update, the learner needs to seamlessly deliver a greeting, an update, and a next step without freezing in terror. The momentum built in the Fluency Round is exactly what allows the learner to overcome the affective filter and actually engage in the conversation.
That's a compelling argument regarding anxiety, I admit. But have you considered that momentum is entirely useless if you are confidently speeding toward a misunderstanding?
Okay, let's unpack that.
This brings us to the final and perhaps most contentious point of the source material's methodology: navigating these complex professional contexts while adhering strictly to the no translation rule.
Which I consider to be the core strength of the entire system.
And I see it as a massive liability. Let's look at the real situation simulation provided in the material. A learner is placed in a simulated office environment and needs to use sentence 13, "I'm almost finished, but I need to check a few details." Or they might need to ask a colleague, "Could we discuss it later this afternoon?"
Highly practical, everyday professional phrases.
Indeed. And the instructor focuses heavily on the delivery, telling the student to take a natural breath, to keep the tone light and polite. But if a student is strictly forbidden from translating these phrases or analyzing the underlying grammar, they are operating blind in a high-stakes environment.
What do you mean by operating blind, though? The words mean what they mean.
They do, but nuances matter. Mimicking a polite tone is superficial if the speaker doesn't fundamentally understand the structural mechanics of the request they are making. If the learner just memorizes the sound of "could we discuss it later" without understanding how the modal verb could operates grammatically to soften a request compared to the word can, they don't actually own the language.
They just have a script.
Yes, they have just memorized the script. What happens when the colleague responds unpredictably? What happens if the boss changes the parameters of the question? If you only possess momentum and physical mimicry, but lack the cognitive understanding of why the words are arranged the way they are, the conversation collapses the moment it goes off script. The risk of miscommunication in a professional setting is just too high to rely solely on physical imitation.
But that assumes that translation is the only way to achieve comprehension, which contradicts how human beings naturally acquire language. The brilliance of this method is that the professional context is the translation.
A context cannot be a translation. You still need to map the vocabulary to a meaning.
Yes, but you map it to a situational meaning, not to a word in your native language. When an infant learns their first language, they don't translate. They associate a sound with an outcome.
But these are adults, not infants.
True, but the source material replicates this process for adults. Look at sentence 9 again.
I'm not sure yet, but I'll find out. The instructor explicitly frames this sentence as a tool to solve a specific problem. She says, use this when someone asks you a question, you don't know the answer, and you need to handle it professionally.
Right, she provides the problem and the prepackaged solution.
Exactly. The method brilliantly bypasses the clumsy, slow process of translating from a native language. Translating requires the brain to hear English, convert it to the native language, formulate a response in the native language, translate it back to English, and then speak.
Which takes a massive amount of cognitive processing.
It takes seconds, which feels like an eternity in a fluid conversation. But by associating the physical phrase directly with the professional situation, the reaction becomes immediate. The learner feels the specific panic of not knowing an answer, and their procedural memory instantly triggers the physical phrase. I'm not sure yet, but I'll find out.
So they bypass the dictionary entirely?
Exactly. The meaning isn't derived from an English to native language dictionary. The meaning is derived from the relief of successfully managing the interaction. This is exactly what native speakers do naturally. We don't parse the grammar of our idioms. We use them as tools to navigate social reality.
That is an excellent point about the speed of associative learning. And I completely agree that translating constantly in your head is a major impediment to fluid speech.
Right.
However, I maintain that this associative method is highly limited. It functions beautifully for predictable, transactional exchanges. Saying hello, dodging a question you don't know the answer to, buying a cup of coffee.
The everyday stuff.
But true professional fluency often requires negotiating complex, novel ideas that have no prepackaged script. When you have to explain a nuanced flaw on a project proposal, you cannot rely on muscle memory alone. You need the structural framework that grammar provides to construct a thought that has never been constructed before.
I think that is a really fair distinction, and it leads us nicely into summarizing our perspectives on this methodology. I maintain that the source material correctly identifies the primary existential hurdle for adult language learners, which is the paralysis of overthinking.
The affective filter again.
Exactly.
Traditional education has filled learners' heads with declarative knowledge, the rules of the language, but left them entirely without the procedural knowledge to actually execute it. By treating English primarily as a physical workout, warming up the mouth, focusing heavily on rhythm and intonation, and prioritizing forward momentum over perfect accuracy, this shadowing technique successfully bridges that gap.
It gets them talking.
It circumvents the affective filter, breaks the habit of slow internal translation, and gives the learner the physical tools to survive that crucial Monday morning conversation.
And I will summarize my stance by acknowledging that shadowing and physical mouth training are genuinely excellent supplementary tools. They are undeniably effective for improving pronunciation, internalizing rhythm, and overcoming initial speaking anxiety.
But not the whole picture? No. I believe that constructing an entire pedagogical foundation on the strict rules of no grammar and no translation is ultimately limiting. While the physical mechanics can provide the illusion of fluency in predictable scenarios, true linguistic mastery, especially in a professional context, requires a deep cognitive rigor. You must eventually understand the structural why behind the words, not just the physical how, to generate novel ideas and adapt to unpredictable communication.
Well, while we clearly view the long-term viability of this specific methodology differently, we certainly have a point of convergence here. We both agree that building the learner's confidence and mastering the physical, natural rhythm of phrases are absolutely vital components of language acquisition. The fear of speaking must be overcome.
Without question. Even if I believe grammatical accuracy must be integrated sooner rather than later, a student who knows all the grammar rules but is too terrified to open their mouth hasn't truly learned the language. The physical practice is undeniably necessary.
And as the source material progresses through its 30-day journey, moving from this initial physical foundation into more complex scenarios, there is so much more to explore regarding how learners can balance this vital physical momentum with long-term structural accuracy. It is a tension every language learner must navigate, and we leave it to our listeners to consider which pedagogical approach they find more compelling for their own journey.
Indeed. It forces us to ask whether we should jump into the deep end and start swimming, even if our form is terrible, or if we should study the mechanics of the stroke before getting wet.
Thank you for joining us on The Debates.